Good evening and welcome. I am Tom Prince, Director of the WM Keck Institute for Space Studies. If you are familiar with the Keck Institute, you will know that we are a think tank for new ideas about the future of space exploration. Also, if you are familiar with our webinars, you know that our programs are all about the science and technology of space exploration. They deal with the technical issues of space exploration. But tonight's going to be a little bit different. We have a special treat tonight. Our speaker is John Logsdon. Mike O'Connell will make the formal introductions in just a minute or two here. But I would like to personally welcome John back to the Keck Institute. He is no stranger to our institute, having visited us several times, including lectures that he gave in 2013 and 2015. Also, before I introduce Mike, who will then introduce John, I want to take this opportunity to thank a few people. These lectures and these webinars, there are a lot of people working behind the scenes that you don't see to make these successful. Just of the many people, I'd like to thank Kathleen Alva and Michelle Judd of the Keck Institute, and also the video wizard, Leslie Maxfield. She has done all our video and audio for our webinars, and she also does much of the video and audio for lots of Caltech remote events. So now I'd like to turn to introducing Mike O'Connell. Mike is a member of what we call the Keck Institute affiliates. That's a group of students and postdocs who are the ones that actually host these lectures. So Mike is a third-year graduate student in GALSIP, the aerospace department at Caltech. He studies the intersection of engineering, control design, and machine learning to understand how to apply safety analysis of classical techniques to modern computing methods. Mike earned his BS in aerospace engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and his master's in space engineering from Caltech, and he is currently working towards his PhD in space engineering. So that's his formal bio, but also I'd like to add a few other things. First of all, he does a lot of alpine sports. He's been skiing since he was 4. He has been playing the tuba since 2006, and including marching in the Macy's Days Thanksgiving Parade. He can't march in many parades these days with COVID, but he's taken up a new hobby, and that is brewing beer. So without any further time, let's welcome Mike O'Connell.
Thanks for that introduction, Tom, and the kind words. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. John M. Logsdon, whose talk tonight is entitled Presidential Leadership in Human Space Exploration, Yesterday and Today. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Logsdon with us tonight. He has a really fascinating career in space policy. We already saw a small glimpse of this during the introductory slideshow. In one image, we saw Dr. Logsdon at the Apollo 11 launch in 1969. Another image was him with John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, all of whom were Ohio born and raised. And then yet another picture was Dr. Logsdon with Mike Collins and NASA Administrator Charlie Bolden. Dr. Logsdon is a professor emeritus at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he was the founder and longtime director of GW's Space Policy Institute. He's authored so many articles, essays, and books, including a number of award-winning studies, such as the John Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, After Apollo, Richard Nixon and the American Space Program, and Ronald Reagan and the Space Frontier. He's also been general editor of the series Exploring the Unknown, Selected Documents in the History of the U.S. Civil Space Program, and my current personal read, the Penguin Book of outer space exploration. Dr. Logsdon is a member of the Board of Directors of the Planetary Society. In 2003, he was a member of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, and formerly he was a member of the NASA Advisory Council. If you can't tell already, he's been a sought-after commentator on space issues for quite some time now. So with that, we're extremely appreciative of him taking the time to join us today. So without further ado, here's Dr. Logsdon.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Tom. Glad to be back working for KISS again. As Tom said, this is the third lecture based on the books I've written that I've given in under KISS auspices. The other two were in Pasadena. I wish I had the opportunity to be there tonight instead of talking to you from my basement office in Bethesda, Maryland. This is some old stuff and some new stuff in this presentation. I'm currently working, I was working in slightly different ways before the pandemic, on a study that compares the space exploration policies of all the presidents since John F. Kennedy. But with the archives shut, it's kind of put me at a semi-full stop on that study. And this is the kind of thinking I'm doing. So let's go to the presentation. Yeah. I was a ROTC student back in college a long time ago, and I got trained in presentations. There certainly wasn't PowerPoint back then. But I was trained to tell the audience what you're going to do it, then at the end tell them what you've done. So this is what I intend to do, is talk about the decisions made by Kennedy, Nixon, and Reagan that have had, I think, a lasting and overriding effect on the U.S. human spaceflight effort. I don't think any of the presidents since these three have made decisions of equal import. And so I'm going to very quickly look at the decisions of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump with respect to space exploration, showing, in my view, why they have not succeeded in changing the legacy of the three earlier presidents. This is in the context of a debate I've been having basically with myself of how important presidential leadership is to what the United States does in space. And I've written books about that, so I must think it is important, but I think it's changing in importance, so that presidential leadership is a necessary but not overriding influence on the future. And I make a couple of remarks about that at the conclusion of this talk. Mike mentioned the three presidential decision books that I've written: John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon in 2010, after Apollo, Richard Nixon and the American Space Program in 2015, and Ronald Reagan and the Space Frontier came out in early 2019. And so a lot of what I'll say in the earlier parts of this talk were drawn from these books, which are available for sale on Amazon and can be bought through the Planetary Society. So Kennedy, this is a picture of Kennedy on November the 16th, 1963. So 6 days before he was assassinated, he paid a visit to Marshall Space Flight Center. And there he's standing with Wernher von Braun, looking, you can't see it, it's what he's looking at a Saturn I launch vehicle that was being prepared for launch. And of course, Kennedy's overriding legacy is Apollo, is sending Americans to the moon. And what I want to point out very quickly is why he did that, and some of the implications of his reasoning on the long-term future of the program. Now, most people think that Kennedy announced, many people, it's particularly in Houston, think that Kennedy announced his decision to go to the moon in a speech he gave at Rice University on September the 12th, 1962. That was his rhetorical space speech. And I'll play a little bit of it just to remind you what he said then.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
Beautiful rhetoric, but it's not why Kennedy made the decision. 8 days after the flight of Yuri Gagarin, the first human to orbit the Earth in April of 1961, Kennedy signed this memorandum to his vice president asking for a rapid review of the space program. And in the balloon there is the operative paragraph, and most importantly, the last sentence. Is there any other space program which promised us dramatic results in which we could win? That's what Apollo was about. It was a space program that promised dramatic results that the United States decided it could win. Apollo was a race. Kennedy made that very clear. Here's you may not know that Kennedy recorded his meetings in the White House. Richard Nixon wasn't first. And here's a recording of a meeting about a week after, a couple of months after his Rice speech, where he was debating with his advisors to whether to put more money into Apollo in order to increase the chances of being first to the moon. The other voice you'll hear here is NASA Administrator Jim Webb arguing back with Kennedy.
But it could affect the design of the Apollo.
Yeah, the other thing is, I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space, no matter how, on the schedule we're doing. I'd spell it out over a 5 or 10 year period. If we could spend it on, why are we spending $7 billion on getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? But so obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority, except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it, we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about.
But you see, when
Cancer and everything else.
When you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what
I
permitted
think
Russia.
everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied?
So Apollo was a race. And I think in Kennedy's mind, there was no doubt that if he was going to compete with the Soviet Union in space, he would do it in ways that the United States would win. He left us in Apollo, I think, a remarkable human achievement, something last year's celebration of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, I think brought to the forefront just how valued the Apollo achievement was. I don't think it was good for the space program, as I will say, but it certainly was good for the country and indeed for the world. It was Kennedy, not Dwight Eisenhower, that accepted the Soviet challenge in space. I mean, the Soviet Union had said its success showed the superiority of the Soviet system. And Kennedy said, well, if we race to the moon and get there first, it will show the superiority of the US system and the rightful role of the US as a global leader. So there was this gap between the real reasons for going to the moon and the public rhetoric. I think that's persisted even till today. In order to get to the moon first, NASA chose a set of hardware that was good for getting to the moon first, and probably not good for much else. It was expensive, it was very risky, and it was not the kind of hardware that you would use for anything else except maybe continued exploration beyond low Earth orbit. Apollo was a peaceful but warlike mobilization of human and financial resources. And it created a space industrial congressional complex centered on human spaceflight, centered on large engineering projects that was in existence when we won the race, demanded to be sustained, and has been sustained in one form or another in the many years, 51 years now since Apollo 11. And I think people still think that Apollo is the right way to do a space program. You know, setting a challenging goal and meeting it is the way to motivate and organize a space program. And I think that's had some negative as well as positive consequences. Well, we went to the moon. 12 Americans walked on the moon. And then there was a new president, Richard Nixon, who was faced with the issue, what do you do once you've been to the moon? NASA's planning came up with a very bravado concept called an integrated program, which used a set of particularly space station modules, the green things here, a fully reusable transportation system, the space shuttle, a reusable tug to move these modules from low Earth orbit, first in a 12-person space station, then a 50 or 100-person space base, maybe in a space outpost in geosynchronous orbit, ultimately lunar orbit and lunar surface stations, and then in the 1980s, using a nuclear-powered space tug missions to Mars. So that's what NASA wanted to do after Apollo. And that was proposed to President Nixon in September of 1969, just a few months after Apollo 11. And his answer was basically, hell no, I'm not interested at all. What we got instead, as you can see in this model with NASA Administrator Jim Fletcher, is the space shuttle. Nixon was not a fan of space exploration. He and his associates very quickly rejected NASA's plans for post-Apollo. He said with 6 more moon missions remaining in December '69, he didn't see any reason to keep going. In a budget trade-off, production of the moon rocket, the Saturn V, was canceled already in January 1970. So there were only the 15 that were originally ordered. NASA, faced with constrained budgets and realizing just how risky the Apollo missions were, Apollo 13 was in April of 1970, canceled 2 missions. And in 1971, Nixon tried several times to cancel 1 or more of the remaining missions. When Apollo 17 left the moon on December the 14th, 1972, to head back to Earth, Nixon issued a statement saying this will be the last time in this century that men will walk on the moon. And by his decisions, he made that forecast reality. The pictures on the right are kind of interesting. There's the Apollo 8 Earthrise iconic image in the Oval Office next to the presidential desk in December of '69, but less than 2 years later, it's gone, replaced by a generic landscape. And that's kind of, I think, symbolic of Nixon's attitude towards deep space exploration. Instead, he approved the space shuttle. What NASA really wanted to do after Apollo was build a space station served by a space shuttle. Shuttle had its origin in the logistics vehicle for the station that NASA had always wanted to build, but decided in 1970 that it couldn't do both, and that a station without a shuttle made no economic or fiscal sense, but a shuttle without a station could be justified. and you see the winning argument. Shuttle could be justified as a versatile and economic system for putting unmanned civil and military satellites in orbit. And with the shuttle, the US can have a continuing program of manned spaceflight without a commitment to a major goal. So you didn't have to do Apollo, but you could continue human spaceflight. Here is a Nixon recording talking about why he approved the shuttle.
After all, since we are going on the space shuttle, and are taking the heat for putting the money there rather than the ghettos and all that sort of thing, but then we better at least get a little credit for it. Because this is jobs. I mean, that's really what's space is, jobs. It's leadership and this and the president.
In March of 1970, even before he approved the shuttle, Nixon laid out a set of principles, which I've called the Nixon Space Doctrine. It's worth reading this because I think it has been the guiding US space policy for the last 50 years, 50 and a half years now. Space as part of a continuing process, taking their proper place within a rigorous system of national priorities, implying the priorities would be lower, becoming a normal and regular part of our national life, not something special like Apollo. And I think that's the way space decisions have been made under Nixon and every president since. So what's Nixon's legacy? Well, rejection of an ambitious post-Apollo plan, a lowering of ambitions in space, but an insistence that human spaceflight should continue. In writing, doing the research for the Nixon book, I talked to John Ehrlichman after he got out of jail. And he said Nixon thought of the astronauts as the sons he never had. So he still saw space as an instrument of national leadership, but also as a high technology jobs program. Shuttle decision in particular was made in the fall of 1971 as Nixon was worried about re-election in 1972 and wanted the employment the shuttle would create in California as part of his election strategy. And created a program without any particular purpose. The shuttle, after all, was just a means. It was supposed to be lower cost and routine, and never turned out to be that. But there was no goal to which the shuttle would serve. Oops, wrong direction. This is a picture of Reagan at the London Economic Summit in June of 1984, standing next to Prime Minister Thatcher, and a model of the space station, which Reagan had approved a couple of months earlier. It's Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone over at the right end of the table. The other people were European, not space agency leaders, but technocrats. Reagan was an interesting personality to research. He, I think, was himself a dreamer, a person with a very long range and very broad gauge attitude towards life in general and space in particular. Listen to these remarks right at the end of his presidency, September 22nd, 1988.
Because in the next century, leadership on Earth will come to the nation that shows the greatest leadership in space. It is mankind's manifest destiny to bring our humanity into space, to colonize this galaxy, and as a nation, we have the power to determine whether America will lead or will follow. I say that America must lead.
So you would think that Reagan would have approved some sort of major space initiatives aimed at a long-range goal, manifest destiny, colonizing the solar system. The reality is he was never asked to approve anything like that. There's a wonderful line that one of his close associates wrote that I used in my book that said he was like a Turkish pasha. He sat kind of passively and let his assistants bring proposals to him and made a decision. So his assistants, his leadership in the White House and the NASA leadership never asked him to approve human space exploration. They decided that the most that the United States should try to do was a space station. And when asked, finally, approve a space station, he said yes. But even then he said, well, you know, how will it help us get to the moon or Mars? So, you know, you could run an alternate history. What if he had been asked? But he was, of course, a fiscal conservative, and he did not increase the priority of NASA within the federal budget. So there's a combination, I think, of, as I say here, Kennedy-like rhetoric and Nixon-like practice. He left a legacy, I think, which shows up again today. Space is a frontier. Space is an area for demonstrating exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. Not to put too fine a point on it, a place to make America great again. But there was no link between these themes and setting an exploration goal in practice. What Reagan did was approve the second step in the plan that NASA had set out in 1969, that is a space station. So you had finally a destination for the shuttle in the space station that Reagan approved in 1984. And then as he approved it, decided to ask our friends and allies, Canada, Japan, and Europe, to participate as partners in the space station development and operation. So I think those are lasting legacies. As he left office, Reagan did approve a statement of national space policy, which for the first time said in a national policy that it was a long-term goal to expand human presence and activity beyond Earth orbit into the solar system. What I'm trying to figure out is what happened to that goal over the past 32 years. 4 out of the last 5 presidents have embraced the goal of expanding human presence and activity. George Bush in July of 20th in 1989, the 20th anniversary of Apollo 11, said return to the moon, this time to stay, then a journey into tomorrow, manned missions to Mars. That came to be called the Space Exploration Initiative. It was stillborn. Don't have time tonight to say why all of these outcomes. That's the research I want to be doing and writing about. Bill Clinton focused most of his attention on the space station and bringing Russia into the station partnership, and actually removed the 1988 statement from his statement of national space policy issued in August of '96. After the Columbia accident, George W. Bush put forward what he called the vision for space exploration, a new plan to explore space, extend a human presence across the solar system, including return to the moon. Mr. Obama said, been to the moon, been there, done that, and changed the goal, changed the destination to be first an asteroid, then with some push from KISS, by the way, to rendezvous with an asteroid, maybe in orbit around the moon, the so-called asteroid redirect mission, and then to orbit the moon with humans. And he said, but it didn't get into policy, and eventually to land on Mars. And then President Trump signed a directive within a year of taking office, saying beginning with human missions beyond low Earth orbit, lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. Well, that's fine. And we'll see whether that last directive embodied in the Artemis program continues. But meanwhile, what have we been doing in space? We've been operating the infrastructure that was proposed by NASA in 1969. The station and shuttle until 2011, and that's cost $4 to $5 billion a year. And with that $4 to $5 billion a year, there's not been enough money to fund an exploration program of the character to achieve these goals of H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump. That's where I say the Nixon space doctrine has been in effect. Where are we now? Is presidential leadership still necessary? I would say yes. I think the president still sets out the goals of national space policy. And so if there's going to be a government program to explore Moon, Mars, beyond, it's going to be articulated by the president. But I think the president has become even more an equal partner in setting national space exploration policy. So I think his role is no longer, if it ever was, sufficient. For example, the hardware that we have built, the Space Launch System Heavy Lift Booster and the Orion, were not mandated by the White House. They were mandated by Congress in the 2010 NASA authorization bill. And NASA resisted building, particularly the SLS, for a year. Again, we may in the Q&A get into discussion whether that resistance was wise or not. But it's Congress that set the goal of deep space exploration and said it will be done by a heavy lift vehicle with a particular set of characteristics and a exploration vehicle based on the already existing Orion program. What about public support? How important is it? Well, we've spent billions of dollars a year in preparing for human exploration since George W. Bush's January 2014 speech, 2004 speech, without focused public support. The Pew Institute did a survey of public opinion on space just about a year ago, a year and change ago, and sending people back to the moon and sending them to Mars ranked last among priorities, and using space as part of the attack on environmental issues ranked first. And yet, and I think it's because of congressional support for more the hardware than the program, that we have spent something like $5 billion a year in recent years on exploration hardware, at the same time spending $4 billion a year on a space station. Can we keep doing that? I think if there's a possibility we can. At some point, if you continue to develop this hardware, it will be ready for use and you're going to use it. And so it's my feeling, whatever happens to the 2024 goal for Artemis, that the United States will use SLS, will use Orion, and some landing system to send people to the moon in the next decade. Again, we can talk about that a little bit later. What about the private sector? Certainly, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have visions of space exploration, and both are building hardware to execute that vision. The numbers there in parentheses are from at least one source of their current net worth. I point out that Elon's net worth is about 5 or maybe 4 times NASA's annual budget. And Bezos, which is this year $22 billion for NASA, and Bezos, 8 times that. So if they would continue to spend money at the rate that NASA is spending, it's $8 or $10 billion a year on human spaceflight. They run out of money fairly quickly. So I think they will play an important role as partners to the government. But in my view, it will be the government that will lead at least the next round of deep space exploration. All right, we think we have a new president. I will say we have a new president. Is there any clue to his space policy? Well, not much. I mean, as a student of the space program for a long time, one of the things I found surprising is that the Biden campaign did not issue a space policy statement during the presidential campaign. And so we're left with what the Democratic Party platform said. And it was very positive on space. You see the words there. The breaking news, maybe for some of you listening to this talk, is that the Biden NASA transition team was identified, named this afternoon. It's headed by Ellen Stofan, the director of the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian, has 7 other people. 5 of the 7 are women. Astronaut Pam Melroy, who has been rumored as a candidate for the next NASA administrator, but all of them space professionals of one form or another. So I expect the transition team to be able, we hope soon, to get to work crafting the Biden space policy. And we'll see. Where are we headed? Well, who knows? Will anything like the Kennedy moment? What I mean is a presidential statement that supports or really urges or maybe sends us into deep space. I can't help but end a talk like this with the quote I saw was on some of the opening introductory slides before I started talking, just because it's great to hear Kennedy speak. So here's where I'll end, and then we'll be open for questions and answers.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Well, thank you all, and I hope you have some questions.